a United States Army colonel leaned across a briefing table at Long Bin in the spring of 1966, pressing one finger against a map of Phuoc Tuy province, the way a man presses his thumb on a wound. He had operational directives. He had charts. He had the full weight of Military Assistance Command Vietnam behind every word that came out of his mouth. He was addressing the commander of the newly arrived 1st Australian Task Force, and he was explaining, in patient and professional detail, exactly how Australian soldiers would be integrated into American search and destroy operations, American patrol protocols, American command structures, and American reporting chains. He spoke for perhaps 7 minutes. The Australian commander listened without interruption, without visible reaction, and without any indication that he was preparing to do anything other than comply. Then he asked a single question. And who exactly would be issuing those operational orders? The American colonel clarified. He would be issuing them through the standard MACV coordination channels, in line with how every Allied force in Vietnam operated under United States military guidance. The Australian commander nodded slowly, folded his map, and looked at the American with the particular expression of a man who has just been told something politely and has decided to remain polite in return. "I think there may be some confusion about our command arrangement," he said. "Our orders come from Canberra." The American colonel stared at him. "Your operational orders," the Australian continued, "do not." "Wait, what?" An Australian task force commander, leading a force that would never exceed 8,000 soldiers in a war consuming more than 500,000 Americans, just told a United States Army colonel that MACV's operational authority did not extend to Australian troops, that the largest and most powerful military machine on Earth did not, in fact, have the right to issue movement orders to the men standing in that room. Oh, this story goes so much deeper than that briefing room, because what the 1st Australian Task Force was about to do in Phuoc Tuy province, and particularly what the Special Air Service Regiment attached to it was about to do in the triple canopy jungle south of the Mae Tao Mountains, would produce results so striking and so contrary to everything American doctrine predicted that military analysts on both sides would spend the next decade trying to explain them. The Viet Cong would eventually give those Australian SAS soldiers a name. 2 words in Vietnamese that told you everything you needed to know about the effect they had on the enemy. Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle. Stay with me, because the story of how a small Australian Special Forces squadron refused American command, developed its own methods, and terrified some of the most experienced jungle fighters on Earth is one of the most extraordinary operational stories to come out of the entire Vietnam War. The thing that Americans consistently underestimated about Australian military culture in 1966 was not the toughness of the soldiers or the quality of the equipment. It was the memory. On February 15, 1942, the city of Singapore fell to the Japanese, and more than 130,000 British and Allied troops were taken prisoner of war, including some 15,000 Australians. More than 1,100 more were confirmed dead or missing. It was the largest surrender of British-led forces in history, and for Australia it was something more personal than a military defeat. It was proof, written in the blood of 15,000 of their own men, that following someone else's command structure in Asian jungle warfare, without the ability to adapt, to question, to operate independently, was a death sentence. The men who survived Changi Prison, who survived the Burma Railway, who came home from Japanese prisoner of war camps carrying the physical and psychological wreckage of what British command doctrine had produced in the Malayan jungle. Those men were not historical figures by 1966. They were senior NCOs and officers. They were the instructors at military colleges. They were the commanders. Their knowledge was not academic, it was lived. While assisting the British during the Malayan emergency, Australian and New Zealand military forces had gained considerable experience in jungle warfare and counterinsurgency. The emergency, which ran from 1948 through 1960, was the crucible where Australian small unit jungle doctrine was tempered into something genuinely effective. During that conflict, large-scale conventional tactics were shifted to small patrols, better suited for counterinsurgency operations. Although not initially well received by many of the brass who had cut their teeth on conventional warfare during the Second World War, a decentralized, small-unit deep jungle operational approach ultimately proved successful. Australian soldiers came out of Malaya understanding at a cellular level what good counterinsurgency looked like. Patience over firepower, intelligence over momentum, population security over body count, and when they looked at what the United States Army was doing in Vietnam in 1965 and 1966, some of what they saw made them deeply uncomfortable. According to historian Paul Ham, the U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk freely admitted to the ANZUS meeting in Canberra in May 1962 that the U.S. Armed Forces knew little about jungle warfare. The Australians knew a great deal, and the question that consumed Australian military leadership from the moment the Vietnam commitment was announced was this: how do you honor an alliance with a partner whose tactical doctrine you fundamentally disagree with without subordinating your soldiers to methods you believe will get them killed unnecessarily? The SASR draws on the experiences of Z Special Unit, M Special Unit, the independent companies, and the Coast Watchers, which operated in the Southwest Pacific area against the Japanese during the Second World War. These units had been disbanded soon after the war as part of the demobilization of the Australian military. However, after observing the operations of the British Special Air Service during the Malayan emergency in the 1950s, the Australian Army decided to raise its own SAS unit. The concept of the Special Air Service had its genesis in the Western Desert Campaign of the Second World War in the British Army. The history of the Australian Special Air Service, however, dates from 25 July 1957, when the first Special Air Service Company was raised in Western Australia. The company was expanded to a regiment and renamed the Special Air Service Regiment on the 4th of September 1964. By the time Vietnam began demanding serious military commitment, the SASR had already been through Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation, conducting the kind of secretive, patient, small-unit reconnaissance operations that would define their Vietnam approach. The regiment first saw active service in Borneo in 1965 and 1966 during the Indonesian confrontation, mainly conducting reconnaissance patrols, including secret cross-border operations into Indonesian territory. The men who arrived in Vietnam in 1966 had already operated behind enemy lines in jungle terrain without American help, without American doctrine, and without American permission to cross the borders they were crossing. They were not interested in learning how to do it the American way. The initial Australian commitment to Vietnam had been an attachment experiment that failed almost immediately. One battalion, the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, was sent in 1965 to serve under American command with the 173rd Airborne Brigade at Bien Hoa. It was designed to be a test of integration. This attachment to U.S. forces highlighted the differences between Australian and American operational methods, and Australian and U.S. military leaders subsequently agreed that Australian combat forces should be deployed in a discrete province. That would allow the Australian Army to fight their own tactical war, independently of the U.S. The Australians were watching American operations in Bien Hoa province and seeing things that violated every instinct their Malayan training had built into them. Large formations moving noisily through jungle, helicopter insertions that announced themselves to every enemy within kilometers, search and destroy operations that swept through an area, found nothing because the Viet Cong had heard them coming and declared the area clear. Then the same cycle the following week, whereas the Americans relied on massed firepower and mobility in big unit search and destroy operations as part of a war of attrition which often resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. The Australians, although not eschewing conventional operations, emphasized deliberate patrolling, using dispersed companies supported by artillery, armored personnel carriers, and helicopters to separate the Viet Cong from the population in the villages while slowly extending government control. Those were not compatible operational philosophies. You could not integrate one into the other without destroying what made each of them distinct. The Australians decided they would not be integrated. Phuoc Tuy, the southernmost province in the Third Corps area, had been selected by the Australians because it was an area of significant Viet Cong activity, was located away from the Cambodian border, could be resupplied and, if necessary, evacuated by sea, and enabled them to concentrate their efforts in a single area to achieve greater national recognition. Rather than being attached to a U.S. division, negotiations between senior Australian and U.S. commanders, including Lieutenant General John Wilton and General William Westmoreland, ensured one ATF would be an independent command under the operational control of U.S. 2 Field Force Vietnam, a Corps-level headquarters in Bien Hoa, which reported directly to Commander USMACV. The distinction that mattered here was between operational control and operational command. Americans could coordinate with the Australians. They could request support. They could share intelligence, but they could not issue orders. General Sir John Wilton, in 1966, the professional head of the Australian Army, had successfully negotiated for a separate area of operations before the first Australian task force was committed to the Vietnam War. In his thinking about the desirable characteristics of an area of operations, Wilton wanted to avoid one which shared a border with either Cambodia or Laos. He also wanted easy access to a port for supply and support operations, and he wanted no U.S. forces stationed in the Australian area. Wilton had clear memories of U.S. Army tactics and high casualty levels from his time as a brigade commander in the Korean War. These were not the preferences of a timid ally. These were the carefully reasoned requirements of a military commander who had watched American methods produce American results, and who had a different standard of acceptable outcomes in mind for his own soldiers. Westmoreland told Jackson to take over Phuoc Tuy, this representing the sum of operational commands to one ATF, while from Australian Force Vietnam headquarters in Saigon, directions were only a little more specific. The Americans had given the Australians their province and a single directive. The Australians would interpret that directive on their own terms, using their own methods, under their own chain of command. This would allow one ATF greater freedom of action, and the chance to demonstrate the Australian Army's evolving concept for counterinsurgency warfare, developed in part from its operations during the Malayan Emergency. The task force would be commanded by Brigadier David Jackson, an experienced infantry officer who had served in the Middle East and New Guinea during the Second World War and later in Korea, and had commanded the AATTV and Australian Army Force Vietnam prior to taking up the appointment. The 1st Australian Task Force was a brigade-sized formation which commanded Australian and New Zealand Army units deployed to South Vietnam between 1966 and 1972. 1 ALAHIF was based in a rubber plantation at Nui Dat, 8 kilometers north of Baria in Puoc Tui Province, and consisted of 2 and later 3 infantry battalions with armor, aviation, engineers, and artillery support. The base at Nui Dat was itself an expression of Australian doctrine made physical. Following the establishment of the base at Nui Dat, platoon patrols and ambushes were initially conducted out to Line Alpha, which was the range of the Viet Cong mortars, and were later extended out to Line Bravo to counter the threat from artillery. All inhabitants of the villages within Line Alpha were resettled nearby. A protective security zone was established and a free-fire zone declared. Although unusual for Allied installations in Vietnam, many of which were located near populated areas, the Australians hoped to deny the Viet Cong observation of Nui Dat and afford greater security to patrols. Where American bases invited their own logistics tails and civilian populations to cluster around the perimeter, creating intelligence nightmares and security vulnerabilities, Nui Dat was ringed by cleared ground and resettled villages. The Australians wanted to see anyone approaching for kilometers. They wanted no population through which enemy intelligence could move freely. They built a fighting base, not a logistics hub dressed up as one. 3 Squadron was the first squadron to be deployed to Vietnam. 3 SAS Squadron arrived in Vietnam in April 1966, and thereafter the 3 SAS Sabre Squadrons rotated yearly until the withdrawal of 2 SAS Squadron in October 1971. Based in Nui Dat, the SASR was responsible for providing intelligence to both the 1st Australian Task Force and U.S. forces operating throughout Phuoc Tui Province, as well as Bien Hoa, Long Con, and Binh Tui provinces. Based on top of the Nui Dat feature, which became known as SAS Hill, the SAS squadrons built up a formidable reputation, both in providing accurate information and accumulating an impressive list of kills. But to understand what made the SASR different, genuinely, fundamentally, categorically different from American Special Operations units conducting similar reconnaissance missions, you have to understand what they actually did when they walked into the jungle and disappeared. Operating in small groups of 4 to 6 men, they moved more slowly than conventional infantry through jungle or bushland and were heavily armed, employing a high rate of fire to simulate a larger force on contact and to support their withdrawal. That description sounds simple. It is not. Moving more slowly than conventional infantry through dense jungle is not a passive choice. It is a trained skill, a psychological discipline, and a physical commitment that requires months to develop and years to perfect. American long-range reconnaissance patrols of the same period were extraordinarily capable soldiers who conducted missions of 3 to 7 days, maintaining regular radio contact and extracting at the first sign of serious enemy contact. The philosophy was find, report, exfiltrate. The Australian SAS philosophy was enter, become invisible, observe for as long as the mission required, and engage only when engagement served a specific purpose beyond mere contact. The traditional role of the SAS was long-range reconnaissance patrols, acting as the ears and eyes of the task force with deep penetration into the enemy's sanctuaries to collect such battle intelligence as enemy unit identifications, strengths and capabilities, movements and intentions. Sometimes snatch patrols were mounted with the intention of capturing a prisoner for interrogation. Operating in 4- and 5-man patrols, the intention was to see without being seen, but they frequently clashed with the enemy and had to fight their way out. Number 9. Squadron RAAF regularly provided rapid and precise insertion and extraction of patrols into jungle landing zones at treetop height. On occasion, SASR patrols were also deployed by M113 armored personnel carriers with a method devised to deceive the Viet Cong as to their insertion and the location of their drop-off point, despite the noise they made moving through the jungle. The deception ran deep into every operational decision. Patrols inserted at one location and walked significant distances from the landing zone before beginning their actual mission, specifically to defeat any enemy monitoring of the insertion point. They maintained radio silence except for brief, pre-scheduled transmissions. They moved at a pace that covered perhaps a few hundred meters per hour through dense vegetation, stopping, listening, reading the sounds of the jungle the way a sailor reads the surface of water, and they stayed. They stayed for days, for weeks, in territory the enemy considered their own. Operating in small, stealthy fire teams of 4 to 6 men, the Australians moved deliberately through the jungles, employing slow and quiet tactics that belied the devastating firepower they could unleash upon contact with the enemy. The NVA soon learned that the presence of Australians in the area meant sudden and overwhelming chaos, as their well-coordinated assaults left adversaries disoriented and overmatched. Australian SASR personnel also worked with U.S. Army Special Forces in Vietnam and provided instructors to the MACV Recondo School and then to the LRRP Training Wing at the AATTV operated Van Keep Training Center from 1967. They were, in other words, teaching Americans their methods, even while those same methods made American commanders uncomfortable. There was a fundamental conceptual gap between what the SASR was doing and what American doctrine expected Special Operations Forces to do. American commanders wanted reconnaissance to support fire missions, find the enemy, fix their location, call in artillery or tactical air support. The SASR gathered pattern intelligence. They wanted to know not where the enemy was on Tuesday, but where the enemy went every Tuesday, what routes they used, what times they moved, what size formations they deployed, what their resupply schedules looked like. That kind of intelligence built up over days and weeks of patient observation was worth infinitely more than a single grid coordinate for an artillery strike, but you couldn't put it in a daily operational report in a way that made sense to an American battalion commander who was being measured by enemy killed per day. The Australians' reputation for instilling fear lay in their ability to create the illusion of larger forces through intense and concentrated firepower. In several communist military histories, Australian regular infantry battalion elements are often referred to as Viet Keech commandos, together with SASR troops, noting that Australian infantry routinely operated in section and half-platoon-sized patrols. The NVA and Viet Cong considered Australian infantry to be elite commandos, as compared to U.S. forces that appeared to operate in larger units. That comparison carries enormous weight. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army were experienced fighters who had been operating in the same terrain for years before either Americans or Australians arrived. Their assessment of who they were dealing with was not casual. When they identified Australian infantry companies as commandos simply because those companies operated in small, dispersed, quiet patrols, they were recognizing that Australian doctrine had produced soldiers who behaved like special forces even when they weren't. The actual SASR, operating in 5-man patrols in triple canopy jungle, moving so slowly and so silently that they left no traceable presence, earned a classification that went beyond commando. During its time in Vietnam, the SASR proved highly successful, with members of the regiment known to the Viet Cong as Ma Rung, or Phantoms of the Jungle, due to their stealth. Special Air Service Regiment troops were reportedly called Ma Rung by the NVA and Viet Cong, Phantoms or Ghosts of the Jungle. The D445 Provincial Mobile Battalion was the principal enemy formation in Phuoc Tuy Province, a local force unit with deep roots in the population and intimate knowledge of every trail, cave, creek bed, and rubber plantation in the province. They had operated in Phuoc Tuy for years before the Australians arrived. They controlled the rural darkness. They taxed villages, conscripted young men, moved supplies through trails they had memorized. And then the SASR arrived and made their trails unsafe. Not through direct confrontation. The SAS rarely went looking for battalion-sized fights, but through persistent, invisible surveillance that made every movement a potential exposure. The D445 Battalion sent tracker teams into areas where SASR activity had been reported. They established listening posts along likely patrol routes and at jungle entry points. Local guides with deep knowledge of the terrain were brought in to help identify where the patrols might be moving. None of it worked. The tracker teams found traces, impressions, the ghost of a patrol route, but the tracks died. The D445 could not find 5 men moving through terrain the D445 thought it owned. That was not a tactical embarrassment. That was a psychological crisis. When your enemy can be anywhere, observation posts become sources of anxiety rather than security. Supply movement becomes a calculation of risk rather than routine. Leadership meetings become dangerous gambles. The SAS patrols were not just gathering intelligence. They were dismantling the D445's operational confidence through the simple act of being present and undetectable. Then came August 18, 1966, the Battle of Long Tan, which proved what Australian conventional infantry could do when the enemy finally decided to confront them at scale. The Battle of Long Tan took place in a rubber plantation near Long Tan in Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam, during the Vietnam War. The action was fought between Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam units and elements of the 1st Australian Task Force. Australian signals intelligence had tracked the Viet Cong 275th Regiment and D445 Battalion moving to a position just north of Long Tan. What followed tested everything Australian training had built. D Company's 105 men and 3 New Zealanders from 161 Battery, Royal New Zealand Artillery, fought for almost 4 hours against soldiers of the North Vietnamese Army, who outnumbered them by 10 to 1. Some 245 enemy troops were killed. D Company suffered 42 casualties, including 18 dead, more than 1/3 of its strength. The numbers are extraordinary enough on their own, but the manner in which D Company held its ground tells the deeper story. Within minutes, everything just went mad. D Company Commander Major Harry Smith recalled. The Australians had encountered an overwhelming enemy force. A pitched battle ensued, but artillery barrages and a risky ammunition drop helped D Company hold their ground. After several hours, reinforcement troops and armored personnel carriers arrived, and the enemy units withdrew. Australian doctrine had trained junior leaders to call artillery support without hesitation and with precision. It had trained soldiers to hold perimeter positions under pressure and not break contact. It had built the psychological resilience for men to fight surrounded and outnumbered without collapsing into panic. Everything that kept those 108 soldiers alive on the afternoon of August 18th was a product of the training doctrine that American commanders had been quietly dismissing as too conservative, too patient, too inactive. The battle was celebrated by American General William Westmoreland, commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, as one of the most spectacular in Vietnam to date. After Long Tan, the Australians had proven their doctrine could survive its most brutal test. The Viet Cong had brought nearly an entire regiment against one Australian company and failed to destroy it. What Long Tan also demonstrated, and what would become increasingly important as the war progressed, was the fundamental difference in how the two allies measured success. In the American system, Long Tan was a body count win. 245 enemy confirmed dead, a ratio that looked good in a daily report. In the Australian system, Long Tan was something more complex. It was evidence of what happened when patient intelligence, the signals intelligence that had tracked the 275th Regiment moving toward Long Tan, was combined with trained infantry who could hold under pressure. The win wasn't just the casualties inflicted. It was the degradation of the 275th Regiment's capability to threaten Nui Dat for an extended period afterward. Those were different frames, and they produced different ways of arguing about whether the Australians were pulling their weight in the broader war. American senior commanders in 1967 and 1968 grew increasingly frustrated with Australian operational tempo. The Australians were conducting constant patrolling, maintaining continuous pressure throughout Phuoc Tuy, but their operations rarely produced the kind of dramatic body count numbers that American commanders used to assess progress. The friction between General Westmoreland's headquarters and the Australian task force became one of the persistent low-grade disputes of the alliance. American generals wanted Australians to push outside Phuoc Tuy province to support American operations in adjacent areas, to participate more fully in the broad sweep of MACV's campaign plan. The Australian response was consistent and maddening to American ears. The 1st Australian Task Force had responsibility for Phuoc Tuy province. It was pacifying Phuoc Tuy province using proven methods. Sending Australian forces to operate under American command in other provinces would require different orders from Canberra, not from MACV. Because it came under the operational command of U.S. 2 Field Forces Vietnam, but under the national command of Headquarters Australian Forces Vietnam. The Commander 1 ATF had to reconcile sometimes inconsistent objectives. The commander reconciled them by maintaining Australian priorities. When those priorities conflicted with American requests, Australian priorities won. Although primarily operating out of Phuoc Tuy, 1 ATF was also available for deployment elsewhere in 3rd Corps, and with the province progressively coming under control, 1968 saw the Australians spending a significant period of time conducting operations further afield. 1 ATF was subsequently deployed astride infiltration routes leading to Saigon, in order to interdict communist movement against the capital during the 1968 Tet Offensive, and later during the Battle of Coral Balmoral in May and June 1968. At fire support bases Coral and Balmoral, the Australians clashed with regular People's Army of Vietnam and Viet Cong main force units operating in battalion and regimental strength for the first time in near-conventional warfare, ultimately fighting their largest, most hazardous, and most sustained battle of the war. The Australians deployed when Canberra determined deployment was appropriate, not when MACV demanded it. That distinction was the entire argument in operational form. The SASR's methods, meanwhile, continued to widen the gap between what American and Australian special operations looked like on the ground. The regiment's 3 squadrons were rotated through Vietnam, carrying out tasks including medium-range reconnaissance patrols, observation of enemy troop movements, and long-range offensive operations and ambushing in enemy-dominated territory. The SASR operated closely with the New Zealand SAS, with a troop being attached to each Australian squadron from late 1968. The combined Australia-New Zealand SAS presence in Phuoc Tuy was modest in numbers and vast in effect. One squadron maintained a sustained presence across Phuoc Tuy province through the second half of 1967 and into 1968. Not one patrol, rotating teams through overlapping cycles that denied D445 Battalion any extended period of relief inside what had been their controlled territory. That rotation created a permanent state of uncertainty inside D445's operational planning. No trail was safe. No meeting point was guaranteed. No movement could be planned in the confident expectation that no Australian eyes would be watching. American observers attempted to understand what they were seeing. United States Army Special Forces liaison officers spent time with SASR squadrons, watched their training methods, read their after-action reports, tried to identify the specific techniques that produced their results. Some elements translated: the value of patience, the importance of absolute silence in the jungle, the discipline to observe rather than act, to wait rather than move. But other elements resisted translation entirely, and those elements were not techniques, they were culture. Organizational culture is the key variable in determining the success or failure of attempts to adapt to changing circumstances. Differences in organizational culture is the primary reason why the British Army learned to conduct counterinsurgency in Malaya, while the American Army failed to learn in Vietnam. That analysis applies with equal force to the Australian SAS. Their operational capability was not a method that could be copied over a training cycle. It was the product of a specific kind of selection, a specific kind of training, a specific institutional memory, and a specific refusal to measure success through metrics that didn't actually correspond to the goal. The Americans could build units that behaved somewhat like the SASR. They could not build units that thought like the SASR, because thinking like the SASR required a relationship with independent, small unit judgment that American military culture in 1966 was structurally unable to produce. During the period of just over 5 years, some 580 SAS soldiers served in Vietnam. They conducted 1,175 patrols, not including 130 by the NZSAS, the majority being reconnaissance, recce ambush, and ambush patrols. Consider what those numbers represent in human terms. 580 men across 5 years, rotating squadrons, each doing their year, each building on the pattern intelligence accumulated by the squadron before them. In a 6-year period, the Australian and New Zealand SAS in Vietnam conducted nearly 1,200 patrols and inflicted heavy casualties on the Viet Cong, including 492 killed, 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, 10 possibly wounded, and 11 prisoners captured. Their own losses totaled 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. 28 men were wounded, 1 killed in action, across 1,175 patrols, covering territory that the most experienced jungle fighters in Southeast Asia considered their own. The kill ratio was, by any calculation, the highest achieved by any comparable Allied force in Vietnam. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment achieved kill ratios exceeding 30-1. And the enemy knew it. The D445 never fully worked out how the Australians moved. They adapted their tactics in response to what they were experiencing. They never identified the method clearly enough to counter it. 6 years of rotating SASR squadrons through Phuoc Tuy produced 6 years of accumulated frustration for the Viet Cong forces who operated there. The D445 Battalion, which had controlled the rural province for years before the Australians arrived, found itself increasingly unable to operate with the freedom it had previously enjoyed. Even the North Vietnamese, accustomed to facing formidable adversaries, regarded the Australians with a mixture of awe and trepidation. That combination, awe and trepidation, in men who had been fighting the world's most powerful military for years and were nowhere close to breaking, says more about the SASR's operational impact than any body count figure. The broader performance of the 1st Australian Task Force in Phuoc Tuy Province bore out what Australian doctrine had predicted. Patient, persistent, intelligence-driven counterinsurgency operations conducted by soldiers who were allowed to develop their own methods without American interference produced measurable results in the province's security environment. Although one ATF had been able to dominate its area of operations and successfully reduce the PA Vien and Viet Cong's ability to influence and coerce the population of the province, while affording the South Vietnamese government some degree of control, this did not last following their withdrawal, and PA Vien and Viet Cong forces began to move back into Phuoc Tuy following their departure. That last point matters and deserves honest accounting. The Australians did not win the Vietnam War. Their methods did not produce a result that outlasted their presence. But for the period they were there, using their methods under their command, they achieved the specific objectives they had set for themselves: dominance of their provincial area of operations, degradation of enemy capability to operate freely, and extension of government influence into previously contested territory. Those outcomes were achieved at casualty rates dramatically lower than American forces sustained in comparable operations. They were achieved not by following American doctrine, but by explicitly refusing it. Many of their extractions were hard, carried out under fire. The SASR was not a unit that avoided contact by design. They were a unit that chose contact deliberately, on their own terms, when the circumstances maximized their advantage. The difference between those two things is the entire story. American frustration with Australian inactivity was really frustration with the fact that Australian units did not generate contact at the rate American units did, because Australian units did not create the conditions for contact unless those conditions favored Australian outcomes. The Viet Cong preferred not to create those conditions either, which is why, toward the end of the Australian commitment, enemy forces in Phuoc Tuy were largely avoiding contact with Australian patrols rather than seeking it. An enemy that avoids you is an enemy you have already beaten in the most important way. You have taken away their ability to operate freely. You have not done this by killing all of them. You have done this by making them afraid of what they cannot see. In October 1971, when the SAS involvement in the Vietnam War ceased, 2 SAS Squadron was disbanded to allow the current Operational Support Squadron to be raised. 1 ATF established the base at Nui Dat in May 1966 and handed it over to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam in November 1971 as 1 ATF withdrew from South Vietnam. The Australians left behind a province that was measurably more secure than the one they had found. They left behind a body of operational experience and after-action analysis that would eventually, slowly, influence counterinsurgency thinking in Western militaries for decades. They also left behind a command argument that was never formally resolved, never fully acknowledged, and never cleanly ended. The United States Army never conceded that Australian refusal to accept MACV operational authority was correct. Australian military culture never doubted it. What the SASR's story in Vietnam ultimately demonstrates is not that small forces can outperform large ones through sheer skill, though that is part of it. It demonstrates that doctrine is not interchangeable, that operational independence is not arrogance, but necessity when two forces with genuinely different methods are pointed at the same war. Differences in organizational culture is the primary reason why the British Army learned to conduct counterinsurgency in Malaya, while the American Army failed to learn in Vietnam. The American Army resisted any true attempt to learn how to fight an insurgency during the course of the Vietnam conflict, preferring to treat the war as a conventional conflict. The Australians did not prefer that. They had been fighting unconventional wars in Asian jungle terrain for 2 decades before Vietnam, and they knew the difference between what worked and what merely looked productive. Successful counterinsurgency requires patience and a sustained effort. The Australians had patience as institutional policy. They built it into their selection, their training, their command culture, and their operational planning. When an American colonel in a Long Bin briefing room tried to override that culture with operational directives, the Australian response was not insubordination, it was clarity. You are not our commander. Our commanders understand what we are doing and why we are doing it. Your directives, however well-intentioned, would dismantle the very thing that makes us effective. The refusal of Australian forces to accept American command in Vietnam wasn't insubordination. It was strategic clarity. The Australians knew how they needed to fight. They knew American methods wouldn't work for Australian force structure. They knew integration into American command would destroy the operational independence their methods required. So they fought their own war, achieved their own successes, and let the Americans complain about it. And the men who paid the price for that decision, the SAS troopers, moving at a crawl through Phuoc Toi's triple canopy dark, the infantry platoons on 24-hour patrol cycles that never fully let them rest. They paid it with the full understanding of what they were doing and why. Their one-year tours, marked by exceptional discipline and strategic prowess, resulted in 1 killed in action, 1 dead from wounds, 3 accidental deaths, 1 missing, and 1 death from illness. For 1,175 patrols into enemy-controlled territory. The mathematics of that record are not just impressive. They are a verdict. The doctrine worked. The independence that protected the doctrine was worth every diplomatic argument it cost. Ma Rung. The SAS operated deep behind enemy lines, conducting surveillance at close range, poised to spring into violent action at need. It was with good reason the Viet Cong came to call them Ma Rung, phantoms of the jungle. Phantom? Not ghost, though the English translation works both ways. Phantom carries something extra. It implies something that shouldn't be there, something that violates the expected order of things, something that appears without warning and is gone before you can organize a response. The Viet Cong named the Australian SAS after what they experienced in the jungle of Puoc Tuai, a persistent, invisible, untrackable presence that disrupted their operations without ever giving them a clear target to strike back at. The Americans never received a name like that from the Viet Cong. Their operations were too loud, too patterned, too tied to the rhythms of their own logistics to generate the specific kind of fear that comes from not knowing where your enemy is or what they know about you. The Australians generated exactly that fear, in exactly the territory they had chosen, operating under exactly the command structure they had insisted on. And they did it by saying, to every American officer who tried to redirect them, 4 words that contained an entire military philosophy: "You are not our commander.